Hi, Jeremy Cordeaux in the Court of Public Opinion. I'm just on air here to let you know that we'll be live streaming the Court of Public Opinion every Friday between 9 o'clock and 12 on jeremycordeaux.com. Please join us. We'd love to have you.
Reading allows me to escape everyday life.
Hi, and welcome to Tsundoku. If you haven't tuned in before, we have stolen that title from Japan. That is apparently their word for the pile of books, usually teetering beside your bed, waiting to be read. I'm Kath Keneally.
And I'm Annie Hastwell. In just a moment, I'll talk to Australian author Fiona McFarlane about her book, The Sun Walks Down, a kind of mystery set in the Flinders Ranges.
Yet another outback noir. They are proliferating and they're good. And later, our Tasmanian literature addict Annie Warburton gives us a rundown on the more personal side of the late Barry Humphries, as revealed in his autobiography, and a novel he wrote believed to be a thinly disguised version of his own life.
Could be interesting. Okay, all that coming up, but Kath, I just want to talk about the Pulitzer Prize because I got quite interested in it the other day. It's shared this year between Barbara Kingsolver, who's probably best known for the Poisonwood Bible. This is for her book Demon Copperhead, and by Herman Diaz, who I haven't heard of before, but a fascinating sounding book that is about set in the Depression, and it's 4 different versions of what's going on in those years, and it draws a parallel between literature and finance. Anyway, that's what I've read about it. Sounds interesting.
Sounds interesting.
But it did make me wonder what the Pulitzer Prize is all about, so I went to Wikipedia, of course, and discovered that it's about books that highlight some area of American life. Now, I went through the list. You know some of the ones that are on the list, no doubt, over the years.
You primed me on this. You said Pearl Buck, The Good Earth, was a very early one. In fact, they go back to about 1917.
17, actually, yes.
Pearl Buck, moving right along, Jennifer Egan, Visit from the Goon Squad.
Lots of women, actually. Beloved by Toni Morrison. And then there's blokes there, of course. Really well-known books. Ernest Hemingway, I think, won it twice. The Old Man and the Sea, obviously, in there. The Grapes of Wrath, John Steinbeck. And a posthumous award given to John Kennedy Toole, who wrote that book called A Confederacy of Dunces.
At one point, that was my favourite book in the world. This is about 30 years ago.
My mother's as well, yes. And we did it at book club and no one liked it.
I don't know how I'd go if I read it again now.
He was a sad creature because he actually died a pauper, unsuccessful. It was very sad. And then, of course, he ended up getting the Pulitzer Prize, which is a prize that inspires great respect.
Yeah, and so the Pulitzer Prize for the novel predates Pulitzer Prizes for journalism.
No, there were 20 categories set up right at the start. They've added in a couple since then, like audio got added in since then. But it did start in 1917.
And so how does it compare to, say, the Miles Franklin here?
Funny you should say that because I went straight to Wikipedia thinking, I wonder if the Miles Franklin has the same criteria. And indeed it does. It's actually for books that highlight an area of Australian life, which is really nice.
It is very nice. One of the things I often notice about the Miles Franklin is that people who bob up to claim a Miles Franklin often disappear without trace.
It's not a ticket to success, is it?
It's not, no.
Interesting. Anyway, let's move to Fiona McFarlane's novel, The Sun Walks Down. I spoke to Fiona about this a week or so ago before she went back to San Francisco where she teaches literature, somehow manages to write novels in between. It's set in the lower part of the Flinders Ranges in the late 19th century. These days, that's a part of the world that looks like the land of broken dreams. It's full of ruins, abandoned stations, all incredibly evocative with a beautiful golden light and the amazing geology of the area. And it's a great, highly in demand for film settings, especially dystopian ones. But her book is set in the late 19th century where they were still dreaming. People still thought that they could grow things up there. And it was before they worked out the Goyder line. And nothing happens over the Goyder line. Don't try and grow wheat. And the thing that drives this book, it's kind of like a mystery, I suppose, except we're in on the mystery, is that there's a young boy lost. And as we know, the lost child is quite a feature in early Australian writing and early Australian obsessions, really.
Paintings too.
Fear of the inland, I think it was all about. It's a really fascinatingly written book in that, as I said, we the reader are hovering above and we have insights into everybody's lives. We can see them all hunting all over the landscape, and the landscape looms really large. So I spoke to Fiona and I asked her about the title, which is really curious, The Sun Walks Down.
Well, the sun walks down is the way you would translate the word sunset from Swedish if you were to do so literally. So one of the Swedish words for sunset literally means the sun walks down. And I have a Swedish landscape painter in my novel who is in the Flinders Ranges in the South Australian outback, and he is experiencing these extraordinary sunsets and thinking about how he might paint them. And it's one of the things that he considers or thinks about as he's thinking about the difficulty of translating the sublimity or the power of the natural world into art.
The landscape looms very large in your novel, and at the beginning it almost, the landscape sets the scene with, you have a storm sweeping through, there's a wedding happening, but we're almost seeing everybody, all these people in this landscape from the storm's point of view. Was that a deliberate technique?
I wanted to introduce the place. I mean, it's incredibly important to me. The place is what began this novel for me. I wanted an opportunity to get people together so that I could introduce them all, and so hence the wedding. And then the dust storm that comes through is the reason that the small child who's at the centre of the novel's plot, 6-year-old Danny Wallace, the reason that he goes missing, he wanders off during the dust storm and no one can find him. So it was sort of an introduction of the place as well as kicking the plot off at the same time.
So through the child being lost, we get to know all these people within this landscape. And once again, you put yourself into people's shoes, or into behind their eyes, really. We're seeing it from their point of view. So we have Aboriginal people, we have settlers, rich settlers, poor settlers. Just pick a couple of those characters and talk me through who they are and why they're there.
Sure. Well, I could talk about Denny. So he's a little boy who goes missing. He's the son of poor farmers, fairly poor farmers, mostly because in the late 19th century in the Flinders Ranges, a lot of people decided that it was going to be possible to plant wheat in the desert, and it turned out that it wasn't. And Denny's family are trying to grow wheat in the desert and sort of failing at that a little. So Denny is a 6-year-old boy who's grown up in the Flinders Ranges, who has his own sort of version of how that particular world works. He's heard the stories, the Bible stories that his mother, who's the daughter of a minister, he's heard those Bible stories. He's heard ancient Greek and Roman tales. He's heard the stories of Billy Ruff, who is his father's Yadliawara farmhand. He's heard the stories that his father, who's from East Anglia, has told about the sort of boogeymen of the East Anglian fens, and he's combined all of those things in his imagination into a cosmology of his own. So his understanding of what the landscape is and what it's haunted by and what dangers it presents is really, really specific to him. And it's based on all of these different sort of cultural touch points that he has come across. And then we could talk a little bit about Billy Ruff, his father's farmhand, who was a really young boy when, 30 years beforehand, more than 30 years beforehand, because Billy is in his 50s by the time we encounter him. But when he was a young boy, when this was still a frontier area and the invasion of the area took place, and he was sort of adopted as a very small child by one of the settlers who noticed in him a particular ability at cricket, or abilities that might translate well to cricket. And he was sort of adopted by this man who was a bit of an eccentric, or a self-styled eccentric, who liked to collect extraordinary things. And he certainly saw Billy with his skills as an extraordinary thing to be put on display. He trained Billy as a cricketer. He got him fully outfitted in his in cricketing whites that were tailored especially for him. And Billy has, for the rest of his life, gone through a kind of negotiation between the life that he would have had if the invasion had never happened, and the life he had because he was singled out by this Englishman. So he is out looking for Denny. He's one of the many, many characters who's looking for Denny over the course of the week that we spend with the townspeople and visitors of Fairley.
Such a strange collection, and yet you get a very clear picture of what life was like at this particular time in the Flinders Ranges. What drew you to this story?
The Flinders Ranges themselves did. I went to Adelaide Writers Week and took a road trip afterwards, went to the Flinders Ranges for the first time, was really struck by the beauty of the landscape, but also the history of it as well. So not only the really, really interesting stories of First Nations resistance that told throughout the Flinders, but also the fact that as you walk around, as you take a bushwalk and suddenly you encounter a ruined chimney or you find a grave in the middle of nowhere, there are whole ghost towns out there. There are sort of towns that were marked out and came into existence for 10 years or less while people thought they could grow this wheat. And so when I was out there, I was sort of feeling as if there was this unsettling feeling of not a ghost town, but a whole ghost region or a ghost desert, which is completely unfair to the place because it is full of history and presence and all of those things. This was just, my initial response to it, I suppose, and it felt kind of unsettling to me. And I realized how appropriate that word was, that what I was seeing here was a history of various unsettlements, including the first really violent dispossession of the original custodians of the land. And so I got really, really interested in just this sort of 10-year period in which white settlement came to the Flinders and failed. And I found myself wanting to write a story around this place and that history and those experiences and see what might happen when I did.
And you really get under the skin of all these people, and although in some ways it's a cynical book, because some of the characters are seen in a very cynical fashion for what they are, there's also a kind of softness towards the hopes and dreams and almost the, as you were talking about, the cosmology, the stories and the superstitions that have come from the other cultures that people have been plucked from, really kind of some sort of against their wishes in some way. People who come from the Fenlands, for example, in England.
And have absolutely no idea what to do with this arid country that's the complete opposite of the Fens. I mean, I hope that all of the characters had, like everyone, people have faults and people are complicated and people's desires drive them in ways that, are more or less selfish, or, people put things at the front of their lives that they put before everyone else. Some of my there's a whole lot of artists in the book and they tend to put art before other people, and they behave quite badly as a result, but to them that is the thing that's most important to them. And there's all sorts of behavior in the book that is judged very poorly by history, quite rightly, but at the time would have felt absolutely like this was the right thing to do. So I'm really interested in these questions about, human behavior and where it comes from and what the result of it is. I think that's what novels are for in so many ways, just thinking about character and thinking about what it means to be a human and to behave as one, because it's really hard to do, to be a human. And so I hope that it's not too the book doesn't condemn any of my characters too enormously. It's interesting always to hear the people that different readers love and don't love, the ones who people assume that I don't like when actually I do really like them, or vice versa, or that sort of thing. I think it reveals something maybe about the readers as well. But there is there's a cynicism or a kind of interrogation that the book is undertaking, thinking in particular about the way in which Australian literature historically Australian literature is white up until really recently, historically the way that Australian literature has written about settlers, has written about the frontier, has written about what it means to be plucky settlers out in the difficult, unyielding landscape, etc. I really wanted to kind of poke at that and play with it and write a novel that didn't do that but was conscious of that at the same time. So there are all these ways in which the novel is constantly undermining itself, I suppose, and sort of saying, I'm not sure that this novel should actually exist, or that we can write a novel like this one now without at the same time really asking questions about who gets to write this kind of novel and what it should be about and what should happen in it.
For some reason, it reminded me of Seven Little Australians. There was that same sense of the bush being bigger than the people within it, the white people, the settlers.
Yeah, a lot of people have made that connection as well, particularly because one of my characters, Sissy, is a sort of teenage girl who is very similar to everyone's favourite character from Seven Little Australians.
Of course, yeah, Joy.
But the book is really, really conscious of all of Australian literature. I want those echoes to be there. There's really deliberate connections to things like Dot and the Kangaroo, which is a late 19th century children's book, which I sort of play around with Beth, who is the Swedish painter's wife, and is writing a similar book about a lost child which goes on to be called Tom and the Wallaby. So the whole book is full of references to kind of classic, in inverted commas, classic Australian literature.
What was it like? You spent the time in the Flinders and you obviously got inspired and awed by the landscape. But when you actually went to do the research, and clearly there's a lot of research in there, did the picture change for you at all?
I feel as if, it did, because the more you learn about anything, the more it changes. But I went in really deliberately with an open mind. I just thought, I don't know what I'm going to find here. I'm not sure what to expect. And I'm really interested in that. So rather than looking for something specific, I was really looking for things that surprised me. And that's partly because one of the things that really, really interested me when I first visited was the history of what were called the Afghan Cavaliers, of the importation of camels in the 19th century to sort of explore the interior of Australia, a lot of which came through Adelaide and up through the Flinders. And so there's a really, really interesting multicultural tradition throughout that whole area, which we don't really associate with many histories that we encounter of the colonial period of Australia, if that is a period that has ever actually ended. But so I was fascinated that I was looking at Muslim graves in the middle of the outback, and so from the very beginning I felt like this place is utterly its own thing, and what I'm interested in about it is the ways in which it doesn't fit into the kind of sanitized version of history that I encountered, say, as a primary school student, or that you sort of tend to hear about. So yeah, I think I was ready to be surprised.
It seems to me like the land did not obey, too, because it's such a big, powerful landscape, and it did kind of repel those early people who were thinking they were going to grow wheat, didn't it?
Yeah, I don't know if we can say it repelled them. I'm always conscious about anthropomorphizing the land. People sort of talk about the land as being a character in the novel, and I think that's true. And as you really rightly pointed out, I open with it, and I make sure that it's there and larger than life throughout the whole book. But everyone has such different experiences of the land, and so much of that is projection from the human beings rather than anything that the land is doing itself. And part of the reason I want to resist that is that so many settler accounts of the landscape tended to anthropomorphize and call it sinister, or call it, unyielding, or call it alienating, or say that it was impassive, or etc. But it's going to look like something entirely different to someone else. For example, it's the first people who lived there and understood how it worked. So I didn't want it to feel as if the land had necessarily had an agency of its own. It was saying, no, I don't want wheat here, and I'm going to make sure your wheat doesn't grow. In fact, it was just really foolish, and there were reasons for it, but it was just really foolish to think that wheat would ever grow there. So I don't know, certainly for some of my characters, it feels as if the land is repelling them. But really, I think they set themselves up to fail. So it's, I'm interested in the psychology around who we blame for our failures.
I do love that feel, though, of a person and the landscape and what is between them, that feeling of being alone in a landscape. And you used the word sinister earlier too, which a lot of people have applied to that part of the world in a way. And the device really for the whole book, or the story for the whole book, is that of a lost child. And that's something that goes quite deep in white Australian storytelling, isn't it?
It is, yeah, and that's another part of the history of writing about our colonial past that I wanted to interrogate and play around with in the book. So as soon as I realized, okay, it looks like I'm writing a book set in the outback in the 19th century, I thought, well, what's the sort of the big story of the 19th century and settlers in the interior, and it's the white child lost in the wilderness. And this was partly because when I was out there was a particular ruined sheep and cattle stations that I was visiting and that I was interested in, and I saw a grave for a very young boy, and I found out a little bit about this particular young boy who isn't Denny at all, and I actually mention him in a kind of secret way later on in the book when someone's listing a whole lot of children who were lost in the Flinders and in Australia just generally. I mean, it happened all the time, but it's also become such, as you say, such a deep part of our storytelling tradition. The sort of cultural myth of the white child lost in the sinister or the melancholy or the frightening bush, and we see it in literature and film and all sorts of things. And then also in the late 19th century, there were two really big cases of children going missing. In one instance, the children were found and rescued and became almost sort of folk heroes, particularly the girl who was involved. And then in the other instance, all three children died. And this was huge news. These were huge news stories at the time. So I thought, if I'm going to write this book about this particular place, let's also explore this kind of founding myth of white Australia, which is partly why the novel is set over 7 days and 7 nights. It's sort of a creation myth, I suppose, that I'm exploring.
Fascinating. I was at a book club the other night and it was being talked about, and the people who hadn't finished it, there's always a few of them, were saying, don't tell us the ending. And someone said, it doesn't matter. The Lost Child is not really the story in a way. It's about a lost child, but it's about something much more than that.
Oh, that makes me so happy to hear. Yes, that is what I was aiming for.
You've used the most unusual methods in this book, and I must say that I come out of it feeling like I've been in the Flinders in that time, but also feeling like I've understood everybody's point of view, which is, I think, quite an achievement.
Thank you.
And just give me a little bit of insight into your history of writing. Is this a new method you're trialling, and where are you heading from here?
I mean, it feels really specific to this book in some ways, because my first novel had approximately 2.5 characters in it, and we only had the point of view of one of them. So this was it's a very populated book, and I spent a lot of time sort of getting into my characters and understanding why they did the things that they did, and how sort of all of their personalities fit together and how they might respond to each other and to the situation and to the landscape that they're in. But it was really important to me writing this book that it never sort of hold up a sign and say, this is the authoritative story of the Australian colonial past in any way. I wanted it to be a book that was full of many voices. They could contradict each other. They could argue with one another. They could have no idea that the other one existed at all. I wanted it to be kind of noisy in that way. And that's why we see the points of view of so many different characters. And there are also these sections throughout the book where we have kind of first person pieces, and they're all different types of narrative, I suppose. There's a prayer, and there's a letter to the editor, and there's a dream, and there's maids telling folk tales and all these sorts of things. And again, that for me is part of thinking about Australia's past as being much noisier and more complicated than it has often been until recently presented to us. There's no sense. I want you to feel totally immersed in these characters' lives and to care about them and to care about whether Denny is found or not. But I also want you as a reader to be thinking in a larger way about this question of who gets to make art and at what cost and whose voices are heard and all of those sorts of things, which is why the book is also full of artists. And the worst character in the book is a white Australian writer, which is meant to be, I'm complicit in that, is meant to be damning of myself as well, who thinks he knows how to sum up what it means to be Australian and what it means to be in this place. And I want to resist all of that while at the same time acknowledging my complicity in it. So that's why it's so kind of complicated. But I also just love thinking about humans and why they believe the things they do and say the things they do, and just getting to explore those really interesting and often contradictory kernels of what it means to be a human in a body in the world.
Fiona McFarlane talking about her book, The Sun Walks Down, published by Allen and Unwin. Gets a really good rap on the cover as well, with Anne Patchett, really well-known American author, giving it her thumbs up.
And now to consider a towering figure, whatever you thought of him, on the Australian arts scene, divisive in death as he was in life, maybe more so. Barry Humphries was nothing if not controversial, and our Tasmanian literature lover Annie Warburton took a deep dive into Barry's writings to get a feel for the real Humphries.
Cards on the table. I love Barry Humphries, always have. He was a brilliant comic writer and social satirist, probably Australia's best ever. When he died, I went to my bookcase where I found no fewer than 12 books by or about Humphries. The earliest is a collection of the Basil Mackenzie comics he wrote for Private Eye in the 60s and 70s. They were banned in Australia until 1973 on the grounds of indecency. I've also got Dame Edna's coffee table book, scripts of old shows, and a collection called Neglected Poems, rude, silly and satirical ditties by Humphries' characters. It's very funny because Humphries was such a wonderful wordsmith and loved playing with and inventing Australian slang. Take the Basil Mackenzie song, The Old Pacific Sea. It contains 4 of Humphries' coinages for vomiting. There's chuckling, hurling, having a liquid laugh, and parking a tiger. And there are 4 others not in the song: throwing your voice, going the big spit, having a technicolor yawn, and calling on the big white telephone. Brilliant metaphors, everyone. I've just reread Humphries' first autobiography, More Please, and his one and only novel, Women in the Background. Both are supremely entertaining, thanks to his prose style, which has the droll, old-fashioned elegance of an Oscar Wilde or a P.G. Wodehouse. The title, More Please, comes from Humphries' first remembered utterance. He says he always wanted more of everything: milk, money, socks, sex, holidays, first editions, solitude, free meals, guiltless pleasures, and real friends. He drops an impressive swag of names in his memoir. He was friends with Spike Milligan, John Betjeman, Bruce Beresford, Peter Cook, John Percival and Sidney Nolan. He has stories to tell about Francis Bacon, David Hockney, Patrick White, Salvador Dali, Michael Gambon and Jack Kerouac. But the revelations about his early life are more compelling. Most fascinating is the light that More Please sheds on the evolution of Dame Edna. She was initially at least based on Humphries' mother Louisa, who he has described as being possessed of a genteel bigotry. I don't know about you, but Edna was a type familiar to me from my own childhood. She could have been my maternal grandmother. Sorry, Nana, I know you had a hard time during the War and the Depression. In her distaste for foreigners and her dismissive contempt for tradesmen and shopkeepers. Anyone, really, who she considered beneath her in social status. Louisa Humphries seems to have been an emotionally cold woman. Humphries tells a story about how he saved up his pocket money for weeks to buy his mother a set of earrings he'd seen in a jeweller's shop window and which he thought matched a glittery evening belt she had. When he presented it to her on her birthday, instead of the expression of love or delight or both that he'd always longed for, her face darkened and she instructed her husband, a kind-hearted, anything-for-a-quiet-life type of bloke, to go straight down to that, insert racist epithet, jeweller, tick him off for selling such rubbish to a child and demand the money back. Humphrey says he often wondered whether his mother loved him. Once he asked her outright. She thought for a minute and said, "Well, of course I love your father most, and then my own parents, and then you and the other children." He mined his mother's prissy respectability in the titles of his shows. "Look at me when I'm talking to you. At least you can say you've seen it." If only he knew when to stop, and isn't it pathetic at his age? He once wrote a sketch in which a young man leaves for work one morning, his fond mum waving him off at the front door. Later that same day, a policeman knocks on her door to tell her son's been knocked down by a bus and killed. The mother grasps the policeman's arm and looks up at him anxiously. "Tell me just one thing, officer. Was he? "Yes," says the policeman with a reassuring smile. His underpants were spotless. Humphries said he wrote More Please because there were already 2 unauthorised biographies about him and he wanted to deter a third. He later said he regretted writing it almost as soon as it was published. He has hinted at guilt over dishing so much dirt on his mother, but he may also have regretted the too candid confession of his own failings. Perhaps that's why he wrote Women in the Background, his only novel. It's a kind of parallel autobiography in which he casts himself in a rather more favourable light. It was written only a couple of years after More Please. The central character is Derek Pettifer, an Australian actor and comic writer who makes it big in the UK with a pantomime dame act based on a frumpy housewife called Mrs. Petty. Like Humphries, Derek Pettifer is a sober alcoholic who loves fine art, collects antique Roman glassware, and comes from a family steeped in Protestant middle-class morality. Derek Pettifer is sexually voracious, but also needy and vulnerable. As in any roman à clef, not everything about the creator and his protagonist is the same. Humphries came from Melbourne, Pettifer from Adelaide. Humphries had 4 marriages, Derek Pettifer only 2. Pettifer neglects his son by his first wife. Humphries became very close to his 4 children. Derek's first wife, Belinda, is portrayed in a very unflattering light. She's a chain-smoking, hard-drinking, foul-mouthed fishwife and a painter. She claims credit for teaching him about art and for introducing him to all the right people when they came to London. She's not Humphries' first wife, Brenda. They were only together briefly before he left Australia. So is the ghastly Belinda a thinly veiled composite of Humphries' 2 middle wives. The dancer-turned-artist Rosalind Hollenrake, whom he divorced in 1970, and the painter Diane Milstead, from whom Humphries had acrimoniously separated shortly before writing the novel. In the autobiography, he appears to admit that both marital breakdowns were caused by his own bad behaviour. Before they split, Rosalind had demanded Humphries go into psychotherapy to control his drinking and rampant sexual infidelity. I looked for a fictional avatar for Lizzie Spender, the woman with whom Humphries finally found love and a happy family life. But Derek Pettifer's current squeeze, Pam, a moody young sculptress he marries despite well-founded misgivings, turns out to be a gold-digging common little tart and nothing like Lizzie Spender. Like Humphries, Derek Pettifer hates a lot of things. Earl Grey tea, the demolition of old buildings, brutalist architecture. He hates conceptual art and the arts bureaucrats who hand out money for it. He's sniffy about people who say basically a lot. He hates hackneyed expressions like rain check and take care and not a problem. On hearing this term from a funeral director on a return visit to Australia, he says this was not so much a phrase as a tick, an infestation, a virus. It raged through Australian conversation like Dutch elm disease or myxomatosis. We can imagine that if he were still writing today, Humphries might have applied the same blowtorch wit to concepts like diversity and inclusiveness and intersectionality. We might also imagine that he would have Dame Edna describe herself as a passionate storyteller and activist. Humphries was that most enviable of people, both a words person and a visual one, but his truest métier was as a wordsmith, and he didn't mind showing off about it. When I first read More Please, I came across so many unfamiliar words that I started writing out a list to look up later. Reboant, eldritch, pingwood, reesty, tatterdemalion. In Women in the Background, the list grew longer. Euonym, aspurgation, strigos, or is it strigos? Mucculent, ringent, euliginous, xanthic, festinant. He obviously enjoys putting his readers to the test, as in, if you can't figure out the meaning of the word from the context, you can damn well go and look it up. But when you do, you realise how exquisitely precise his word choices were. Humphries had his faults. He was a bit of an intellectual snob. He could be peevish and sarcastic. When asked his views on transgenderism, he asked, "How many different kinds of lavatory can you have?" This trademark flippancy has always irked his more earnest critics, but his fate was sealed when he went on to describe the current tide of transgenderism as a fashion and gender reassignment surgery as self-mutilation. The Melbourne Comedy Festival, of which he was a founding patron, removed his name from its major award. For some strange and scary reason, no debate is allowed on the idea that self-identity trumps sexual biology. Dissent is not tolerated. Those who point out the threat to women's spaces, safety and sport, or to the welfare of vulnerable minors, are shouted down with accusations of bigotry and hatefulness. Humphries wasn't alone in offending against the new orthodoxy. Some, like J.K. Rowling and Germaine Greer, are too rich or influential to be adversely affected, but the brilliant Irish comic writer Graham Linehan, who created Father Ted, Black Books and the IT Crowd, has had his professional career almost destroyed for expressing the same views. We are not grappling here with the thorny question of how to separate an artist's work from their moral character. Both sides here claim the moral high ground. Trans activists say it's about the rights of queer people. Their critics say they're defending the rights of women and children. It's not a moral question, it's a social, medical and political one. And like everyone else, grumpy old conservatives should be allowed to say what they think about it without being subjected to mean-spirited censoriousness. Give Barry back his Barry, I say.
And that was our woman in Tasmania, Annie Warburton, looking at two books by and about Barry Humphries.
And you're listening to Tsundoku, the podcast for happily addicted readers everywhere.
And remember that we'd love to hear from you. So if you're keen to share your reading habits, your reading past, the favourite book of all time for you, or give us a glimpse at what's in your Tsundoku, you can send us a voice memo to tsundokucast@gmail.com.
That's it for Tsundoku today. Thanks for joining us. I'm Annie Hastwell.
And I'm Kath Keneally. Catch you next time.
This podcast is produced by 4 book addicts refusing treatment.
Kath Keneally.
Michaela Andreev, Sarah Martin.
And me, Annie Hastwell. Our thanks to composer Quincy Grant for the music. If you want to know more about the books and authors featured in this episode, check out the show notes. You can find us on Facebook and Instagram at TsundokuCast. That's TSUNDOKU cast.
Hi, Jeremy Cordeaux in the Court of Public Opinion. I'm just on air here to let you know that we'll be live streaming the Court of Public Opinion every Friday between 9 o'clock and 12 on jeremycordeaux.com. Please join us. We'd love to have you.